I know the folks who are listening on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, Feyi, can't see my head about to explode. But for those, watching on YouTube and watching on geneticsforhealthcare.com and watching the video feed, by the way, subscribe to the YouTube channel, by the way.
We learned that the sites that offered testing at point of care had a 2 times higher patient uptake rate than those practices who were implementing a more traditional referral model to genetic counselors. We're going to try and close equity gaps. We're going to try and improve patient access. We've got to make it so that there are fewer barriers.
I wish I had an applause track right here.
First need to make a decision about whether they want
point of care testing.
Genetic. One thing that's interesting about being a technology innovator is that you want to build something that delivers a repeatably consistent outcome across all of our health systems. We don't want, something that depends on someone being good at their job.
You can tell my head's about to explode because you created this software that proved the use case for this type of approach.
This is Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast for patients.
Today, I am grateful to have Feyi Ayodele, founder and CEO of Cancer IQ, to talk to us about how technology, her technology, and other technology solutions are innovating new ways for technology to better diagnose and treat diseases like cancer. Feyi, thank you for being a guest on Genetics for Healthcare.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start from the beginning. You went to some really prestigious schools and, had kind of a healthcare background in terms of your studies. But what was it that sparked your interest in being an entrepreneur and building companies, specifically a technology company?
So I always tell people I'm actually an accidental entrepreneur. I started off my career in financial services and management consulting. It was actually part of me trying to stop being typecast as a finance person and get on more healthcare related studies that I chose after getting my MBA at Wharton to work directly in healthcare operations at the University of Chicago and in their cancer program. Now, at the University of Chicago, I had the opportunity to work under a world-renowned breast medical oncologist and cancer geneticist who at the time had recently won the MacArthur, Genius Fellowship, but someone who I also get to call Mom. And in working with my mother at the University of Chicago, I got to understand a little bit more about this incredible work that she had done in their program. She was the founder of the very first cancer risk clinic. This is one where she obtained a really detailed family history and did genetic testing on all patients. She did this not only for patients who had cancer, but for those unaffected family members who are at elevated risk. And she used this risk information to tailor everyone's precision prevention strategy, including many of those women who didn't want to pursue prophylactic surgeries. She was really monitoring them and surveilling them over a very long period of time. And what impressed me about this is she was saving lives. She was not only saving lives, but she was a very meaningful contributor to revenues at the University of Chicago. So let's go back to me. One of my goals at University of Chicago was to expand this really innovative clinical and actual research enterprise across to other University of Chicago community-based affiliates. And when I got there and I tried to stand something up, I realized everyone just said no. They said, we don't have the staff, we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the grant funding and the grateful patients to stand up a program like Dr. Olapade's. So we just can't do this. So coming from the financial services industry, which a decade earlier had really made life for me so much easier because of data analytics and software and that whole technology wave that happened in finance, I knew that technology could ultimately solve this problem. So instead of going back to McKinsey, which I believe I was supposed to report back to in May of 2013, I left the University of Chicago to found this company, which I truly believe could democratize access to genetically informed care and build programs like the one I saw at the University of Chicago.
So as you mentioned, it's not easy to create these programs, right? You have to, first of all, if you're working in a healthcare system supported by, public dollars, you have to make the business case, in which a lot of cases then screening for conditions weren't revenue generators, if you say that. But what was the problem, if you can pinpoint it? I mean, it was an ecosystem problem, but what was the problem, I guess, first that you saw and set out to solve at Cancer IQ?
For me, again, as a management consultant, I really looked at everything from a process design perspective. And as we went out to these community-based affiliates, we were trying to model what my mother's program did. We needed to think about a way to achieve that exact same experience in a lower resource or lower staffed clinical setting. So the first gap I found was really just providers even knowing who was eligible for genetic testing. At the time, even the family history data collection process was a major barrier, because even if you use me for an example, I have over 30 first cousins. And if you were going to interview me about my family structure or family history, that would take the entire visit. Providers even knowing who is eligible for genetic testing or even starting that family history conversation really wasn't scalable. So then I'd say the second problem, so let's say they are actually gathering family history and they're understanding a little bit more about who meets criteria for genetic testing. The second problem was actually getting access to genetic testing. The traditional model of genetic service delivery requires a provider to identify and actually refer that patient to a genetic counselor. But I was just even looking over the most recent NSGC professional status survey. And right now, there are less than 1,000 adult cancer genetic counselors that are available to provide direct patient care. And on average, they see less than 10 patients a week. So even if you are good at identifying those patients who meet criteria, the next bottleneck or gap is getting those patients in to see a genetic counselor. And in most of these community-based affiliates, they said, well, we just need to send them to University of Chicago, which defeats the whole purpose. Providing streamlined access to those genetics professional, I'd say, was a huge gap, and we needed to rethink the way that we were going to solve that problem. I think the third problem, and I'm glad you actually mentioned this whole business case, right? How do we even make this something that is financially attractive for a health system? I'd say the way it becomes financially attractive for a health system is letting them know that, by going through this genetic evaluation process, by enrolling those patients in a high-risk program, they are going to come back to the health system for these downstream services that have much higher contribution margin than the standard of care routine screening. So those breast MRIs, those more frequent colonoscopies, those risk-reducing surgeries are all things that end up being the carrot for healthcare administration, but in practice are very difficult to get patients into. Because I'd say the third barrier that I identified is, okay, let's say you do identify people and you do get them tested, bringing them back in is a much more complex pathway for patients than just remembering to get a mammogram around your birthday every year. And at the University of Chicago, my mom had this whole infrastructure and team of people that called and coached and thought ahead about prior authorization. But in your ordinary provider's office, they didn't have that. So using the risk assessment and genetic testing results to actually drive action among patients, I'd say is the third gap that I identified when trying to roll this out more scalably.
So you just mentioned some things. I want to unpack it. One, the GCs, the genetic counselors, are the subject matter experts in the healthcare systems that are responsible for consulting patients, for signed consent, to sign off that says, hey, you're taking this test and these are some risks, but this is information that you're going to get. One of the challenges, academic centers like the University of Chicago, those centers have genetics programs. They have these genetic counselors because they can afford them. they can afford a genetics program to screen these and get them into high risk programs. But 80% of the population in the United States are treated in the community. Community centers many times don't have genetic counselors available. When you think about rural areas and outside of the major metropolitan areas, how did you think about that in terms of technology bridging the gap? So, you started University of Chicago, but how did you turn your gaze to, okay, where is the biggest need? And have you been able to measure the effectiveness of a hospital system that's in South Dakota versus one that's in, a major metropolitan area with large academic centers like Chicago? Have you been able to close the gap and think about that with technology?
So that's exactly what I needed to unpack at the time. And the best way for me to think about expanding the genetics workforce was to follow alongside the people who are doing that already. So my mother at University of Chicago and two of her esteemed collaborators, Kathy Blazer and Jeff Weitzel at City of Hope, were really the founding team behind the City of Hope Cancer Genetics Education Program. program. I'd say it is probably the most widely recognized as a training ground for non-genetics providers to be able to offer cancer genetics care. And they've trained people from every state across the country. They've trained people around the world to offer genetics and truly expand that genetics workflow. So the first thing that I did was I actually modeled from the faculty at the City of Hope Genetics Education Board exactly what the steps are for that pre-test counseling encounter and even that post-test counseling encounter. What are all the elements that need to be a part of it? And in collaboration with them as my early product advisors, we actually built a TurboTax-like platform that allows your everyday provider to deliver what I consider to be primary genetics care. It allows them to identify who's appropriate, order the appropriate tests, auto-generate a pedigree, engage in shared decision-making with patients, and make it so that just about everybody can do this without having a genetic counselor embedded in their practice. They can use their genetic counselors to handle those specialty genetics care patient. In the same way that TurboTax made it so that not everybody needs to have a CPA, that's really what I believe the Cancer IQ specialist has done in the genetics field, is we've really made it so that we can turn your everyday provider into a genetic specialist with the use of software.
So one of the challenges that you just mentioned, and I want to ask your perspective on how far technology can take us to making genetics in healthcare mainstream. Many healthcare providers still don't routinely incorporate genetic risk assessment into primary care or specialty care, even though we go in and we fill out these papers on our intake that says, yes, I have a history of cancer. Many times those notes don't make it into the chart for the doctor to ask and do a more thorough investigation that says you might be eligible for screening and other things like that. How do you think technology is going to make it easier for clinicians to identify and then refer high-risk patients to specialty care?
So we've learned over the years that you can't just focus on the provider. There's so many studies that are out there about the effectiveness of both a provider prompt and a patient prompt to increase compliance with whatever evidence-based recommendation has been out there. That's where I'd say Cancer IQ has really been super innovative. So in our digitized family history intake or cancer risk assessment, patients are not only providing their family history and providing their risk factors, but we're immediately educating them about things that they are eligible for or next steps that they need to take with their provider. They're almost given a hit list of here are all the things that you should discuss on the agenda of the appointment you have coming up with the provider. And in tandem, one of the things that we have done in parallel is, the provider also has the provider-facing version of this report. And they're not just getting, for example, a Tyrer-Cuzick score that says, this patient's lifetime breast cancer risk is 32.6, because unfortunately, your traditional primary care physician can't always manage that and know what to do next. They're getting something nice and elegant and consumer-friendly, saying, here's a checklist of all the things above and beyond standard of care that your patient's appropriate for. Do you agree? And that first part of the workflow where we're just identifying and trying to take the provider to move forward on that first next step, we found that we have been incredibly effective in getting both patients to bring it onto the agenda and providers to actually comply with that next step. But that's not all. I think the other thing that we found is important for providers to take that next step, especially if that next step is genetic testing, is making sure that there is a circle of care for those patients should they test positive, right? We always think about that primary care physician who's almost a hot potato primary care physician where they're like, oh, now we found somebody that's way too complex. I really, really don't want to be responsible for that. So even beyond that initial patient experience where we're identifying patients who are appropriate and we're getting patients access to genetic testing, Cancer IQ has invested heavily in resources and tools on the back end, not only for the provider, where they can kind of enroll patients in high-risk programming that will automatically kind of set it and forget it and say, here's what your next steps are. We've also invested very robustly in that patient-facing experience where they can get personalized education on their next steps. They can get reminders 30 days in advance. They can be given a lot more of those details on this is what you need to get from your primary care physician. This is what you need to get through, prior authorization. Even give them this calendar of what they need to do so that they can self-manage their care and their providers feel a lot more comfortable that there's infrastructure around that patient that will help them stay on their precision prevention or early detection plan. Because when you have all of those resources in place, there's no longer an excuse to progress the patient to that next phase in their journey. And that's exactly what the Cancer IQ technology has done. And in how we've implemented across health systems, we make sure that there's no way for patients to potentially fall through the cracks.
I am a believer that technology is the key to bridge that gap and to address equities, because what I say is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. We talk about disparities of outcomes. We talk about disparities with demographic groups or people not getting access to certain tests and innovative therapies. And this might be kind of like a rogue rant here. So I apologize in advance, Feyi, but there are institutions, they have a cancer registry every year where they will say, hey, we treated this many cancer patients, we treated this many breast cancer patients, we treated this many, and they will subtype them. What stage, what molecular subtype, all those things. They'll know that, but they don't track how many of those patients receive genetic testing, or for that matter, even were offered genetic or genomic testing. And I'm a believer that these tools can track how well a physician or a healthcare system is offering equitable care. And if you are not up to snuff or you don't meet certain standards, you can't participate in clinical trials, for instance, or you won't get reimbursed, or you might take a ding on reimbursement. How are you thinking about how these digital tools, AI, chatbots, telehealth, play a role in not only empowering the patient, but empowering healthcare systems to ensure that they're offering equitable care?
I am so happy you brought that up. So, Cancer IQ's culture and origin story really comes from that research and almost epidemiology point of view. A lot of my mother's research is looking at, disparities in outcomes, but not just between, black and white, but what's the molecular basis for some of these disparities in outcomes. And the only way that you can actually prove that point is if you look under people's skin as routinely as you do in your white patient populations. When I say that we launched this company to democratize access to genetically informed care, it's also that eventually we could start answering these research questions that are so important to have, molecular information behind. Let me give you an example. And I think we're fortunate to be in these times because it always hasn't been the case. But the Commission on Cancer and the National Accreditation Program for Breast Programs, for example, these are both two, accreditation bodies from the American College of Surgeons. And, every year our accredited programs need to be evaluated and surveyed. And in their most recent survey, they actually ask for not just the denominator of patients that you had, but that numerator of patients who actually received testing across different tumor types. And you wouldn't believe, how many people scrambled, to a system like Cancer IQ because they just didn't have any data. You can try and look in the EMR, but if you don't, garbage in and garbage out. Right? You can try a natural language process, all sorts of things, but if nobody actually gathered any family history and we don't know if that patient met criteria, you don't know your gaps and you don't know where you could be. What I appreciate about our culture and also our platform is that we include with Cancer IQ an analytics layer of our software where we look at just about everything. We look at how many patients met criteria, how many patients expressed interest in moving forward with genetic testing. What are some of the decline reasons for genetic testing? So we can slice and analyze that data on a practice level, on a provider level, and understand what are the things that we need to do differently about how we implement Cancer IQ. And through that continuing process improvement, we've identified a number of things, not only in the practice level, but across the entire Cancer IQ network that we've shared in the public as best practices. And here's one of them. When we looked across our portfolio and we looked at the places that had the highest testing rates, right? Highest number of patients who met criteria that actually followed through with testing. Guess what one of our conclusions was? We learned that the sites that offered testing at point of care, where the provider who found the patient who met criteria actually offered testing right then and there, had a 2 times higher patient uptake rate.
Wish I had an applause track right here.
We're implementing a more traditional
point of care
referral
testing
model to genetic counselors. It is very obvious, right, that if we're going to try and close equity gaps, we're going to try and improve patient access, we've got to make it so that there are fewer barriers. We don't want a patient to first need to make a decision about whether they want genetic testing, then make a decision about whether or not they're going to call someone back about scheduling an appointment, then make a decision about whether or not they're going to pay for parking again to come back in just to get a blood test. There are newer, more innovative ways to implement genetic testing at scale that will make it so that 2 times the number of patients who are getting access to genetic testing today can actually do that. And what I'm proud about is that we're doing this in partnership with the genetics community instead of in conflict with the genetics community. And here's one particular program I wanted to highlight. There's a genetic counselor who is leader of the genetics program at Dignity Health on the West Coast. She first became a client of Cancer IQ because one way that we expand the genetics workforce is we actually make our genetic counselor users twice as productive, right? Instead of them having to hand draw pedigrees and manually enter information into multiple systems. Cancer IQ is really a productivity solution for them. So when she first came to Cancer IQ, that was the initial use case. How do I get double the number of patients from the genetic counseling team that I already have? And we were very proud of that. But what I love about Ashley's ambition is that she too also understood this data. That, this referral model coming to the genetic counseling team wasn't the best way to provide access to care. And in a pilot that they did with their OBGYN clinics, they used Cancer IQ to identify who met criteria. And lo and behold, 27% of the patients walking through a traditional OBGYN practice met criteria for genetic counseling. And we started off slow. We didn't want to change things overnight. Those patients were referred to genetic counseling. And lo and behold, there was now a 12-month backlog for Ashley's genetic counseling team. Now, instead of her then appealing to her leadership and saying, I need 10 more genetic counselors, I think she realized there needed to be a compromise. There needed to be a more scalable way of providing access. She was the one who came up with the idea that we need there to be point-of-care testing in these OBGYN practices so patients can immediately get access. She even branded the program. I love this name. It's called the Proactive Living with Early Detection and Genetic Education Program, otherwise known as the PLEDGE program. And all members of the PLEDGE program would get genetic education at point of care, leveraging some of Cancer IQ's tools. They would get pre-test counseling, in a shortened form of that from their provider. They would get their tests, and on the back end, they would see the genetic counselors so that Ashley didn't have to double her team to accommodate these patients, but she could increase it a little bit. And I'm proud to say that this new implementation model that she's rolled out across Northern California has now resulted in 4 times the number of patients getting access to genetic testing than what they were doing several years ago.
So I know the folks who are listening on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, Feyi, can't see my head about to explode. But for those, watching on YouTube and watching on geneticsforhealthcare.com and watching the video feed, by the way, you guys, for the audio, check out and subscribe to the YouTube channel, by the way. You can see us live. But here's the deal. For background, and Feyi, you know this, but if you're listening to this, my background has been as an executive, as a business strategist in the life science industry, bringing these types of tools that expand, patient access to testing that unlocks patient access to therapy, clinical trials. Feyi, I had to spend almost 2 years when I was in a role leading a division to convince the team to have a point of care testing strategy. And the reason why you just unpacked, and we've been talking about this throughout the podcast, one, there is a shortage of genetic counselors in the community where the majority of patients in the U.S. receive their care. Secondly, when a patient is diagnosed with cancer, whether it is colorectal, breast, ovarian, there are certain guidelines that say this patient should be receiving germline genetic testing. But what happens is the oncologist who, to your point, wait, this is too complex, I don't want to deal with this, there's somebody responsible for that, let's send them there. But first, I need to treat you. So I'm going to do, surgery, the radiation, the systemic chemotherapy and things like that. And after I'm done, we're going to send you to your genetic counselor. Well, that backlog might be 6 to 12 months just to speak to a genetic counselor. But there's nothing preventing the attestation that says, hey, this patient watched or they read this disclosure about genetic testing, and to collect a specimen, whether that is a cheek swab, whether that is a tube of saliva or blood, just to get the report that says you have a variant that you should get more counseling, or you don't, and don't worry about it. And that reduces the backlog. What you can tell my head's about to explode, because you created this software that proved the use case for this type of approach. I mean, since you did that, and since you're seeing these kind of results, how is it spreading? How are your customers, how are their attitudes and receptiveness to using technology in their practice? And what are the barriers that you're seeing from customers that they're having bringing those tools in?
That's a great question. So again, I want to start first with our genetic counselor users and really that persona that is trying to scale themselves, right? I found that our genetic counselors are much more satisfied at work, especially our veteran genetic counselors. You don't want to do the same spiel every day about breast cancer risk and what those outcomes may be. The American Society of Breast Surgery has said that all newly diagnosed breast cancer patients should be getting genetic testing. Imagine how many times you would go through that spiel over and over again, and what it would mean for you as a genetic counselor in terms of your job satisfaction. These genetic counselors using Cancer IQ in these hybrid models can spend more of their visit time counseling patients who actually have genetic mutations, who actually have complex issues to deal with. So I'd say the job satisfaction is great, particularly when they know those providers who are doing testing on their own are doing it the right way. We have fail-proof software on the front end that is making sure patients meet criteria. Patients are receiving the most comprehensive panel they can be. Patients are getting access to this testing through the guidelines of insurance so that the out-of-pocket pay can be as low as possible. And I think when people are comfortable with what's happening on the front end of the process, just makes it so much easier to be happy about your role on the back end of the process. So that's kind of what we see in terms of the response from our genetic counseling community and our end user base. I'd say the biggest barrier to us scaling this, and if you think about the pledge program, what we needed to do is that we needed to make sure that experience in the OBGYN clinic was as seamless and easy for those providers as possible. And this is where I'd say we'd have barriers that we've been able to overcome. So the biggest barrier, and the reason providers say, I don't want to do this, it's going to take too long, is getting back to that principle I said before about it interrupting the agenda of the visit. Our most recent releases of Cancer IQ have made it so that we're packing as much pre-visit when it comes to the genetics education and the family history documentation and the elements of pre-test counseling. We're putting as much of that ahead of the visit as possible. So again, the experience that we have from our OBGYNs is great, not interrupting the agenda. It's not taking too much time. They're not feeling insecure about how to respond to certain questions they may not know how to answer. So I think that big barrier about how do we find a way of fitting it into these clinical settings where they'll feel comfortable with it, those are barriers that we've overcome. I'd say the last barrier, and this comes to just where our health system is right now. Any of these initiatives, especially if you're investing in software like Cancer IQ, there's going to be a cost to that, right? So you're investing in precision prevention, you're investing in precision early detection. And I'd say the biggest barrier that we find is how do you get the executive leadership of health systems to agree that this is a priority and this is going to be financially accretive for them. And while we've had that barrier in the past, here are two things that we at Cancer IQ are doing to help overcome those barriers. The first is we're showing them the data. On a regular basis, we are interacting with our longest term customers to actually pull real outcomes and claims data from the EHR to show them the downstream revenue that they've been able to accomplish with Cancer IQ and their cancer risk assessment program to date. We look truly at incremental services that wouldn't have been recommended and the patient wouldn't have gotten access to. And we're finding that we are generating millions of dollars in value above and beyond what Cancer IQ even estimated during our original business plan with our customers. So we've actually launched a formal study called the Value Study to do this not only within the Cancer IQ customer base, but more broadly, so that we can truly demonstrate the return on investment of these kinds of programs. So that's the kind of second thing that we're doing to scale this practice more broadly. And then the third thing that we're doing is, one thing that's interesting about being a technology innovator is that you want to build something that delivers a repeatably consistent outcome across all of our health systems. We don't want, something that depends on someone being good at their job, for example, right? We have really passionate providers who are going to do everything to make sure their patients get from point A to B. But we also want to make sure it works with that provider who's less engaged, who's not going to go above and beyond. And that's how we know that our software is doing what it promises to do. So the third thing that we're investing deeply into now is really that almost AI-enabled navigation of patients, to make it so, again, your provider doesn't need to think about all those next steps. And Cancer IQ can think about what hyper-personalized education and navigation and reminders are needed to get that patient to comply with their cancer prevention and early detection plan and deliver that ROI so we can do it more consistently across our end user base.
I think that's phenomenal. And I know your company is called Cancer IQ, but this is just flat out genetics IQ, because the use case and the application and the way that you're helping professionals be more efficient and get to the answers that patients need and are looking for apply in other diseases as precision medicine grows into cardiovascular disease, neonatal, diabetics and other metabolic diseases. What's the eye on the future for this to expand and, again, make those genetic counselors even more effective?
I've always been asked about that. And one thing I'm happy to report is that, the same technology framework that we have for Cancer IQ does apply to other conditions. So we can, annotate our pedigree with other kinds of conditions. We can kind of identify people who might be eligible for other kinds of genetic testing services. In fact, we've already piloted with one of our customers the early framework of kind of cardiac IQ to get patients to their desired destination. But if I'm going to be honest, what motivates me and what inspires me and what I'm so excited about is that there's still so much work that we can do in cancer. Because what I see as the next frontier on our horizon is not just trying to make sure that hereditary cancer testing is part of routine care. I think there's going to be opportunities to make sure that multi-cancer early detection tests are part of routine care. Minimum residual disease tests are part of routine care. And I think the way that health systems and providers are going to be able to apply these new kinds of diagnostics that are all within this value chain of cancer prevention and early detection, the core framework that providers are going to need to understand to know who gets what is that personalization, that risk-based recommendation engine that is the core platform offered by Cancer IQ. So where do I see us going? I see us, expanding broadly in cancer because there's so many novel diagnostics that can apply to the Cancer IQ patient populations, while at the same time expanding to other chronic conditions that have this genetic basis where we can help all patient populations get ahead of avoidable genetic diseases.
Well said. Well said. And we look at the same problems and are trying to solve them. And through this medium of podcasting, we're reaching, Feyi, those who are decidedly non-medical. I love to ask my guests, because people come to this platform and listen to these episodes and watch Genetics for Healthcare website, YouTube, wherever, to get the language to help fight for a loved one, right? For access to, in this case, germline genetic testing or hereditary testing for any type of inherited disease, especially when the guidelines dictate that they should get that test. But what are 3 practical tips that you could share with our audience to help them advocate for what should be routine genetics testing through screening how can they talk to their primary care provider, or if they're in a specialty cardiologist or an oncologist? What are 3 practical tips that you can help them communicate their need and advocate for themselves to get access to germline genetic testing?
I mean, here are my real practical tips. Sometimes I tell people, don't ask for anything genetic. Sometimes when you ask for genetic testing, the providers automatically default to like, oh, I'm just going to send you to a genetic counselor. And what I tell patients, and again, members of my family, to advocate for is to remember the higher goal. An easy conversation, an easier, more relevant conversation where a primary care physician would feel like it is their duty. I need to make sure I'm getting the appropriate cancer screenings. And the only way that I can do that is if I know my risk. So I first ask people to advocate, understand their risk, because unfortunately, in today's environment, a lot of providers think that risk is something based on age. Oh, you're not at risk for cancer until you get to age 50. That is not the case. I think my second point is that really age doesn't matter anymore. We are looking at so many patients who are being diagnosed at early and earlier ages and later stages. And the only way to overcome that phenomenon is if we try and train our physicians and train the people who are caring for us to think about true risk. That might be genetic risk, that might be lifestyle risk. But if you just ask about risk, it kind of forces them to think further about truly understanding where your risk lies and using that to personalize your, early detection or prevention strategy. And same thing on the treatment end of things. Hey, doc, right? I really just need to understand my risk and what we're doing to manage that. Because they may be thinking, yes, I'm going to treat this condition that I see in front of them. But they might make a completely different treatment decision if they understand that you're at risk for secondary primaries, or you might be at risk for other different factors. So know your risk is number 1. Number 2 is reminding them that age doesn't matter. And then number 3 is to share your story. If you have any family members, if you have any friends who have been through this experience where they really were impacted by an unnecessary cancer that could have been caught earlier, that could have been intervened upon earlier because of a genetic risk factor or a familial risk factor. Doctors are human, and the more that you tell these stories, the more they can understand that it's really, really important, and you need them to feel it's important too. So those would be my 3 tips.
Feyi Ayodele, founder and CEO at Cancer IQ, and probably my best Duolingo streak partner in learning Spanish that I've got. Okay, for real, folks, she's my friend on Duolingo. I'm learning Spanish. I think you're learning Spanish too.
I am.
But we got a 266-day streak. I mean, so I love competitive people. I love, really, driven people that are always learning new things. Feyi is one of those. Hey, my streak is 673 days, by the way. I don't even want to know what yours is. It's probably longer than mine.
No, I just started. Actually, I think today might be day 365.
There it is. Feyi, I cannot thank you enough for delivering such rich information to help us understand how to have conversations around risk and how technology is going to help close the gap in learning that. Thank you for being a guest on Genetics for Healthcare.
And thank you so much for having me.
This is Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast for patients.